What are you? You're a tough guy now, huh? I thought you were just supposed to be the simpering, but, open to conversation Trump defender. Of course, I remember you when you said he was like the worst thing in the world, but everything's convenience these days, right? It's getting you paid.
Here's what's actually happening in this setup. Chris Cuomo isn't just previewing a clip, he's drawing a line between analysis and performance. Scott Jennings isn't framed as a serious conservative voice. He's presented as a repeat character, a familiar fixture whose job is provocation, not persuasion. And that matters, because when media rewards the same behavior over and over, it trains audiences to mistake noise for strength. Listen closely. This is the tell. This isn't about personal beef. It's about whether accountability still interrupts the show or whether the show always wins. And here's the deeper truth. Democracy doesn't weaken through one argument. It weakens when bad faith actors are treated as inevitable instead of challenged. If you believe the path forward is built on progress and inclusion, hit that subscribe button. Let's make this community the strongest voice for democracy online.
You see this clip of Scott Jennings saying, how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to enforce me not saying the word illegals anymore? How are you going to do that?
Say illegals anymore, because ICE is directly targeting legal citizens of this country. And how
are you going to enforce your edict on me, just out of curiosity?
Listen, I understand.
But just listen to his point about illegal.
No, what are you, bully now? What are you, tough guy? Because you're talking to this kid who happens to be right, calling people illegals. They're called illegal aliens in the law. And you know what? A long time ago, Republicans and Democrats switched to undocumented. Why? Because it seemed inhuman. That's why. They changed the vernacular, and you know it. But that's not the point. The point is, how are you going to do it? What are you going to do? What are you? You're a tough guy now, huh? I thought you were just supposed to be the simpering, but, open to conversation Trump defender. Of course, I remember you when you said he was like the worst thing in the world. But everything's convenience these days, right? It's getting you paid. But be careful. If you want to be a tough guy, there are plenty of tough guys out there. You want to see how somebody can make you stop saying illegal? And then what are you going to do? Sue? Tough guy. How are you going to enforce that? So if somebody beats your ass because you're being rude and disrespectful and causing division in this country that's causing distress and pain all over the streets and making people want to hurt one another. If you really want to be a part of that, as the expression goes, FAFO, don't be a tough guy. Make tough points. But remember to be decent. You're not a tough guy, okay? You're a guy with slick to the side hair, a slick tongue, and everybody knows what you're doing. Don't be a tough guy, not you.
This is the moment where honesty refuses to hide behind politeness or spectacle. You can criticize Chris Cuomo, and many do, without denying that Chris Cuomo is entirely right here. Yes, Chris Cuomo, particularly in his NewsNation appearances, has a long-standing pattern of both sides framing. Chris Cuomo often wants to point out the flaws of Republicans and then quickly pivot to the imperfections of Democrats. Chris Cuomo will say, sure, Republicans do bad things, but what about the Democrats? And on the surface, that sounds fair. But fairness is not the same as truth. Democrats have flaws. Democrats sometimes compromise too much. Democrats sometimes make poor choices. Democrats are not immune to criticism. But Democrats are not advancing an authoritarian movement. MAGA Republicans are. And failing to name that distinction clearly, as Chris Cuomo does here, isn't partisanship, it's accountability. Listen closely. This is the tell. Scott Jennings is not a serious political thinker. Scott Jennings is a recurring media character. Scott Jennings is someone who thrives on performance, especially on Abby Phillips's CNN show, where Scott Jennings appears over and over with the same formula: smug certainty, calculated posture, and a veneer of toughness designed for the camera rather than for reasoned debate. Scott Jennings himself has admitted that his role exists somewhere between professional politics and professional wrestling. That's not an apology. That's a window into the entire act. Scott Jennings is a performer first, an analyst second, and a truth teller last. Because when Scott Jennings talks, he isn't trying to persuade anyone. When Scott Jennings mocks language debates, telling people not to say illegal but instead undocumented, Scott Jennings isn't defending the law. He's signaling dominance and creating spectacle. When Scott Jennings scoffs, he's not demonstrating conviction. He's demonstrating how much he can get away with on television. That is what Chris Cuomo is calling out. This is exactly why Chris Cuomo matters in this exchange. Not because Chris Cuomo is perfect. Chris Cuomo has his own faults, and many would say Chris Cuomo leans too heavily on both-siderism. But here, Chris Cuomo refuses to let Scott Jennings hide behind theatrics. Chris Cuomo recognizes that fake toughness, Scott Jennings' smirk, his over-the-top bravado, his repeated media appearances, survives only when someone does not disrupt it. Chris Cuomo disrupts it, and disruption in this case isn't spectacle. It's accountability. Here's what this moment really exposes. Democracy doesn't erode only through policy missteps or elections. Democracy erodes when bad faith actors like Scott Jennings are normalized. When networks, like CNN with Abby Phillips's show, platform someone like Scott Jennings repeatedly without interrogation, audiences are trained to mistake confidence for competence, performance for principle. That is a slow, invisible erosion. That is how spectacle replaces substance. That is how bad actors gain influence without responsibility. And the moral contrast becomes unavoidable. MAGA Republicans reward performance, grievance, and conflict without consequence. MAGA Republicans reward those who create division and flaunt civility as weakness. Democrats, flawed as they are, still operate within democratic norms. Democrats respect elections. Democrats respect pluralism. Democrats respect the institutions that make accountability possible. Treating MAGA Republicans and Democrats as equivalent is not balance. It is moral confusion. And that confusion is exactly what Chris Cuomo refuses to entertain when calling out Scott Jennings. You don't have to like Chris Cuomo. You don't have to defend Chris Cuomo's past network choices. You don't have to excuse Chris Cuomo's moments of both-siderism. But when Chris Cuomo chooses clarity over convenience, when Chris Cuomo calls out Scott Jennings by name for turning politics into entertainment, that moment deserves attention. That moment is about accountability, not personality. That moment is about defending the idea that media figures, whether it's Chris Cuomo or anyone else, have a duty to truth, not theater. Because accountability doesn't require perfection. Accountability requires someone willing to say, calmly, forcefully, and publicly, that democracy is not a stage, and Scott Jennings is not entitled to treat it like one. Chris Cuomo does that here. And in a media environment awash with performance, that is precisely why this moment matters. This is the difference between performance and principle, between spectacle and democracy, between someone like Chris Cuomo, who chooses truth even when inconvenient, and Scott Jennings, who chooses image over integrity. And that distinction is the heart of why we should pay attention.